How much do you really know about the Black Lives Matter movement, or Antifa for that matter? How much do you really know about the protests that have been going on for the last 30 days over the George Floyd murder by a police officer? How much do you really know about these movements and their goals and their mission? Do you believe the president and believe that they are just anarchists and looters and violent thugs who just mean to tear down democracy and kill white people and defund the police? Is that what you believe? Or do you think that this is just a modern version of the civil rights movement like we saw in the 60s and it's not really that nefarious? Today I'm going to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm going to talk about Antifa. I'm going to talk about a lot of the myths that we have been hearing about both groups. And I'm going to do that by studying the history like I have been in this series. My name is Carolyn, and yes, I live in an RV, and yes, I do videos about my life living in an RV, but that doesn't mean I don't have a brain. That doesn't mean that I don't think about current events. It doesn't mean that politics and what's going on in the world doesn't affect me, because I believe it affects all of us. And as I have said in my previous videos, I went to college, studied history and political science, and so I'm kind of a geek in that respect. I love research, and so this new series called As I See It on Tuesdays is my view about current events, taking a historical view at how we got to where we are today and how history has affected what is going on in the world today. So come on, let's go inside, grab a cup of coffee, and let's have a chat.
There ain't nobody gonna do it for you. Got to find your own.
Hello, all you beautiful friendly people, otherwise known as friendlies. So are you ready to get started on today's As I See It? Some of you liked in the beginning, I thought of it as a campfire chat, and I said that this series was really just about what I'm passionate about, and that what I talk to my friends about, and anybody who's ever sat around a campfire with me, this would be a campfire chat that we would have, because these are the issues that I really care about. And when I did the first video about buying land and really just kind of came out about my political beliefs, I think many of you knew them to begin with. The support that I got for speaking my mind about that, and all the people who thanked me because it was things that you were thinking too, just really encouraged me to speak out even more. But I know a lot of people watch my videos, watch my channel just for RV related stuff, which is fine. So I thought that my whole channel was, my whole part of this life was a political act, but a lot of people don't want to hear politics. And I just want to thank everybody who is interested in this, because I'm excited that it's just allowing me to do what I love, which is research and read and think and all of those fun things, and I get to share it with you. And I'm wearing my, what is it? You're entitled to your faulty perception of my reality shirt, because I think it's fitting, because there's a lot of faulty perceptions of reality going around. But without further ado, grab a cup of coffee and maybe a s'more if you want to pretend we're sitting around a campfire, and we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter today. But first of all, let's talk about history and how we got here. And we can't talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, without first talking about history and what led up to the Black Lives Matter movement starting. You'll remember in the last video about Confederate monuments, I talked a lot about white supremacy in the United States, and basically how it was built upon white supremacy. The first slave was brought over, I think, 1619, and I talked a lot about how in order to slave another human being, you had to declare yourself supreme over that human being. You had to make that other person less of a human, which is in itself white supremacy. So, I mean, that kind of breaks down what white supremacy means to its very basic meaning. It means that you reign supreme over other races. And so I think it would be difficult to deny that we have a history of white supremacy. And as I talked about in the last video, in the monuments, I talked a lot about whether we should tear down the Confederate monuments. I talked a lot about the post-Civil War white supremacy, and I showed you graphs of how many of the Confederate monuments celebrating Confederate soldiers were erected during key points in the fight for civil rights for Black Americans. We saw a rise in Confederate monuments being erected when there happened to be a big rise of Ku Klux Klan activity in the South, a lot of lynching of Black Americans, and then again we saw a resurgence of these monuments being built during some big cases like Brown versus Board of Education and desegregation. So I have established in that last video that just because slavery ended, white supremacy has not ended, and that those statues were intended to say, we are still supreme, stay in your place. I think that many of us can agree that 150 years ago, slavery ended officially, but that doesn't mean that a lot of the problems of white supremacy have gone away. And in fact, the civil rights movement was meant to make Congress and Americans face the fact that Black people in this country were being killed without impunity for offenses like trying to vote, trying to go to a school, the same school as whites, which historically and still today tend to get more money. They tend to have better education. And so in the past, Black Americans, for fighting for the right for equality. Separate is not equal. There was a whole thing in the civil rights, where the white supremacists and the legislators and the voters were trying to argue that you can't be separate and equal. Well, that's not true. That's not true today. That is not true that many of the poor, disadvantaged neighborhoods, a lot of the predominantly African American neighborhoods are underfunded in education, in infrastructure, in public service, and public health, and that's still happening today. So the civil rights movement in the 60s, 50s, and 60s meant to shed light, or not even shed light, but was an effort, a movement to allow African Americans to be truly equal in our society and to not be killed. I mean, this was state sanctioned. I mean, we all remember the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and again, I did a video on it. I'll put the link up here, where people were killed by white law enforcement and state sanctioned entities. People were killed for trying to exercise their right to vote. And we just lost. I want to pay tribute here. I loved seeing him on my favorite news shows. He always came on as a commentator. Representative John Lewis, we lost this week. A true hero and civil rights leader. He was beat. He was bludgeoned. He even had a fractured skull. All because he was trying to vote. He believed in peaceful protest, and I remember him telling a story very recently, like within the last couple weeks, on one of my news shows. He was interviewed about his activism and told the story of Bloody Sunday. On March 7th, 1965, 600 people assembled at a downtown church in Selma, Alabama, to pray and began walking silently, 2 by 2, through the city streets on a freedom march for voting rights from Selma to Montgomery. John Lewis was among them. He was the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they were stopped as they were leaving Selma at the end of the Edmund Pettus Bridge by 150 Alabama state troopers, sheriff's deputies, and possemen who ordered the demonstrators to disperse. 1 minute and 5 seconds after a 2-minute warning was announced, the troops advanced, wielding clubs, bullwhips, tear gas. John Lewis suffered a skull fracture, and he was one of 58 people treated for injuries at a local hospital. And the day we know today is Bloody Sunday. R.I.P. John Lewis, a true American hero fighting for what is right. We need more people like that who are willing to fight for what is right, even when it seems the whole country, the whole system is against you. We need people who are willing to fight. So R.I.P. John Lewis, a true hero. And so let's remember the civil rights movement. This is a movement in which, and we still probably most of us remember the pictures of the dogs and the fire hoses, turned on Black people, mostly Black Americans, who were trying to fight for equality. And this was during the era of Martin Luther King. This was peaceful protest and fire hoses and dogs and batons and fractured skulls and beat in the knees and just all kinds of horrific violence at the hands of white people sanctioned by the state, police officers, National Guard. They beat Black people for trying to get equality. Trying to go to the same schools, trying to sit at the front of the bus, trying to sit at a lunch counter in a restaurant alongside white people. This is what they got. This is the punishment they got for daring to declare equality. For exercising and fighting for their right to life and equality and equal protection under the law, they were beat, sometimes killed, imprisoned. This is 1960s. This is what? 60 years ago. This is what was going on in our country. This is the violence that was going on in our country 60 years ago. Barely before I was born. Actually, I was born in 67, so it was probably even going on when I was born. So history shows us that in previous civil rights movements, that when black people assert their constitutional right to peaceful protest, to gain their inalienable right to humanity and equality, that white people respond with violence. History shows us that when black people assert their rights, their constitutional rights to peacefully protest, that white Americans respond with violence. More than 4,400 black people were murdered by lynching from 1887 to 1950. 4,400 black people were murdered by lynching from 1887 to 1950. During the Jim Crow laws, when they were still trying to keep black people enslaved. Again, this is a few generations, a couple generations. This stuff does not go away overnight. And when the 15th Amendment passed, which gave black men the right to vote, southern states used terrorism in the form of lynchings and mob violence to prevent black Americans from voting. There was a constitutional amendment, the 15th Amendment, which gave, finally, black men the right to vote, and white mobs used violence and terror and threats to prevent them from exercising those rights. And economic progress by black people was also met with mob violence and terror. How many of you have heard of Black Wall Street? I just learned about this, and I can't believe that 52 years old, I can't believe that I'm just hearing about this. These are the stories that are just coming to light.
I also just recently read another story about some black soldiers in World War II, American soldiers, and they were in Europe somewhere where there was no segregation. There was still segregation in a lot of parts of the United States. And so these black soldiers, they were out and they went to a restaurant in Europe. It was a mixed restaurant. Anybody could go there. Well, the white American soldiers came along and had a fit and literally started a war with these black soldiers. They had a fit. They expected American values and American rules to apply in Europe. And so they couldn't stand that the black soldiers in Europe were sitting in the same restaurant as white people. And so the white soldiers literally started a war with black soldiers. And of course, this was never reported in the United States because nobody wanted Americans to know that basically white soldiers were fighting their own. They were fighting black soldiers who were fighting for the United States. They waged war against them basically in Europe because they had the audacity to sit in a restaurant with white people, which was allowed in Europe. So this systemic racism and this systemic white supremacy is a real thing that went on even in wartime. But back to the Black Wall Street. Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921 was a prosperous, booming neighborhood of black Americans. Despite all of the forces that tried to keep them down, that, tried to keep them from exercising their freedom to live and prosper, they were doing really well. There was booming business, and it was one of the most prosperous black neighborhoods in the country. Well, the white people of the area weren't having it, but they ended up making up a story that a young black man from that neighborhood attacked a white woman in an elevator, and so a mob of whites went in and torched the neighborhood. The law enforcement stood by and let it happen. And what were happening, I remember reading that they would torch the houses, and as the people ran out of the houses, they would shoot them. And law enforcement, local law enforcement, just let it happen. These are the forces that Black Americans in our country have had to face since the beginning of time in America. And just like generational history on a personal level matters, it matters also as a collective. Think about the traditions, the values, the mores, the stories, the wealth or lack thereof, like in my case, that was passed down from generation to generation. Think about those things in your own family. Our society, our collective, is made up of individuals, so it's no different. To deny the history of us as a country is basically to deny your own history, to deny the impact of your own ancestry and ancestral experiences in your own life. And just look at tradition. Everybody's talking about tradition of the South. We want to hold on to tradition, and it means a lot. Well, if that personal tradition means so much to you, then that same rule, that same theory has to apply to Black Americans who had literally any wealth or any progress they made was met with mob violence, was met with lynchings, was met with torching their neighborhoods, was met with just some kind of oppression. It may not even have been as obvious as torching and violence, but oppressive mindsets and oppressive experiences, and even going to school or going to work and being in the workforce and still dealing with oppression. Imagine that being passed down from generation to generation and what that would do to current generations. So that is the history of this country and what the Black Lives Matter movement is responding to. So when we think about things like the World War II Black soldiers in Europe who had the audacity to try to sit at a restaurant and eat with white people, or the Black Wall Street who, these Black Americans who had the audacity to thrive, they had the audacity to do well, and the white powers that be just had to stomp on them, had to show them. Or the civil rights movements where people just wanted to be able to eat in a restaurant like everybody else or like the white people, or they wanted to vote and they were met with violence and dogs and hoses 60 years ago. What does that mean for Black people today? And that's where Black Lives Matter comes in. The Black Lives Matter movement began in 2013 by a couple of women founders, and it was in reaction to the Trayvon Martin murder and the the acquittal of George Zimmerman. George Zimmerman, as many of you know, was an off-duty security guard, rent-a-cop, who saw a Black teenager in a hoodie with a pocket full of Skittles, thought he was dangerous, and despite real police saying back off, don't follow him, he followed him and he shot him and he killed him and he was acquitted. And so Black Lives Matter movement started in reaction to that. They started it as a call to action against state-sanctioned violence and anti-Black racism. There's a lot of misinformation floating around about what Black Lives Matter is and what it means and what their goals and their purpose are. So I'm going to play for you now a KPBS interview with one of the founders of Black Lives Matter who's going to talk exactly about what their goal and what their mission is.
After George Zimmerman was acquitted in the murder of Trayvon Martin, folks like Patrisse Cullors and Opal Tometi, who are co-founders of Black Lives Matter, each of us felt deeply that it was important for us to build a base of people who were ready to counter anti-Black racism, which permeates our society. And so Black Lives Matter is really a call and response. It's a response to the virulent anti-Black racism that our society faces and struggles with, and it's a call to action that we take the time to dismantle that.
Sure, and I'm glad you said that. My next question was about this. Are there specific demands or call to action from the movement?
Absolutely. Well, they're the same demands that people have been fighting for a long time. We stand on the shoulders of giants, folks who have made sure that we have a seat at the table and that we're able to participate in our nation's democracy, that we're able to live in full dignity and respect, that we're able to make wages that support our families, that we have full housing and employment, and then, of course, that we stop and stem the tide of police brutality that's ravaging our communities.
So there's certain call to actions, as you said. What might be some examples of that?
Well, so for example, one of the things that we've been calling for is for our federal government to collect data on officer-involved shootings, which they don't currently do. We've also been calling for a reduction or an elimination of federal funding for the militarization of our police departments. There's no reason that our police departments need tanks, bazookas, and flash grenades in local communities.
Let me ask you.
And I know a lot of you don't think that the violence against black people is real. A lot of you think that police kill white people too, that there are white people who get arrested, that black people get arrested because they deserve to be arrested, that the cops are more in high crime areas. These are all the arguments that I have heard against the Black Lives Movement. Well, some of the arguments I've heard against the Black Lives Movement, Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of you really think that black people getting murdered by police, getting imprisoned, that they deserve it. I'm going to talk a little bit about that because I've been doing a lot of research and a lot of reading to kind of prop up what I thought, and I've learned a few things. I've learned that I'm wrong about a couple of things. So one of the things from Al Jazeera, so the police have killed about 1,000 people a year from 2015 to 2019. 1,000 people a year killed by police officers. Black people are 2 times more likely to get killed by police than whites. Black people are about 13% of the population, but they are 2 times more likely to get killed by police than white people. Contrast that to the United Kingdom. 1,000 people a year killed by police officers in the United States. In the UK, 23 police killings from 2006 to 2016. In 10 years, 23 people were killed in the UK. In that same 10 years, 10,000 people were killed by police in the United States. So, you know, we can argue all day long that black people commit more crime, that the police hang out in the high crime areas, and that's why black people get killed more. You can argue that all day long. I think, though, that it's safe to say that we have a problem with law enforcement in our country. That 10,000 versus 23 is a problem. And you're going to say, yeah, okay, well, the population of the UK is a lot smaller. Okay, I did that homework. The population of the UK is 66.65 million. The population of the United States is 328 million. That means we have 5 times more population than the UK. So if you want to argue numbers, 23 people in 10 years, even if you multiply that times 5, adjusting that for population, that would mean 115 people murdered by police in the UK over those 10 years. So that's 115 versus 10,000. Did you know that there is something the police have called qualified immunity? I first learned about this on a commercial on a YouTube video by the ACLU. By the way, I contribute monthly to the ACLU. I encourage you maybe to do the same. They do really good work. But did you know what qualified immunity is? So for police and government officials, qualified immunity shields them from being personally liable for constitutional violations. So what does that mean? That means that if a police officer violates constitutional rights of a citizen, search and seizure, illegal search, stop and frisk, any constitutional violation, qualified immunity gives them the benefit of the doubt when it comes to court for them violating constitutional rights. So what does that mean? Think about this. Imagine a disadvantaged person from a disadvantaged neighborhood, not a lot of money, gets pulled over for something stupid, or maybe, you know what, let's say he gets pulled over, there is no probable cause. 0 probable cause when he gets pulled over. But he gets pulled over, they search his car for no reason because maybe the young guy doesn't know. He can refuse that, and in the car they find a joint. And so he goes to prison for that joint because he doesn't have the money for a decent lawyer, and the police have the police unions behind them, giant lawyers, and they have qualified immunity, which means basically they are given the benefit of the doubt in any situation. The police are given the benefit of the doubt in any situation. And to make things even worse, there have been groups like the ACLU and other nonprofit organizations who have been trying to record police violence. They want to better understand the demographics and the facts behind police violence and police killings and things like that. But law enforcement agencies are failing to provide the public and nonprofit agencies with the data about violence by police officers and deaths. The recent Death in Custody Reporting Act of 2013 was passed, and these law enforcement agencies are still not abiding. They're not following the rules. They are not providing the data that they are required to report by this act. So let me just say something here. I don't think all police officers are bad. I don't think a majority of police officers are bad or racist. I think they have a really, really, really difficult job. I can't imagine the stress of some of them in the really rough neighborhoods, putting their lives on the line every day. I understand all of those. What I don't understand is that they are the trained professionals. And I've seen recent videos, you know, a knee on the neck, an altercation between a police officer and a drunk guy in a Wendy's parking lot. This is the problem I have. And it's not necessarily with police officers. They are the professionals. They're the ones with the guns. They're the ones with all the power. They are the ones who are supposed to rise above the situation. They're supposed to be trained well enough to be able to handle drunk people, to be able to handle whatever situation. And again, I understand it's a stressful job. I don't want to be a police officer. I understand it's really stressful. But the point in bringing all of this up is to show that the system is working against citizens, but especially Black Americans. That if there is a Death in Custody Reporting Act in 2013 and law enforcement agencies are still refusing to abide by this act, we have a systemic problem. And unfortunately, this systemic problem seems to really hurt Black Americans.
And what about the Police Lives Matter?
Police lives matter as well. And again, I think the issue here is that we have a system of policing that often functions in a discriminatory way. And so most police would tell you that they got into the profession not to be discriminatory, but to help people. And so what we want to see is a complete transformation of policing so that we can actually solve problems in our communities as opposed to criminalize them.
No.
So on June 8th, the Democrats in Congress proposed creating a nationwide registry of police misconduct with mandatory reporting. So we already have an act in 2013 not being followed. So in June 8th, Congress proposed creating a new act to try to get this, under control so that we can so that our police departments and our law enforcement can start having more accountability. And Trump ended up approving a much more limited version on June 16th by executive order. And I'll put a link to the description if you want to read it, but it's a much more limited version. And I think I remember some debate over chokeholds. So I think he's still allowing something like chokeholds. But these are the forces that are going on in this country that are causing many Black Americans to feel victimized, to maybe be victimized. And I'm going to take this a step further. So again, if you still think that this is not a problem just for Black people, I have more data. I did a lot of digging and I have more data. Okay, so a couple more pieces of data and then I'm going to move on to what BLM is and is not. So I looked at arrest trends from the Bureau of Justice. I went directly to the Bureau of Justice statistics. I'm going to put the link in the video below. in the description below. So I was looking at arrest trends versus sentenced trends. And this is very telling. Seen some arrest records for 2016. So in 2016, 6,175,680 white people were arrested for all crimes in the United States. In that same year, 2,407,003 Black people were arrested for all crimes in the United States. So some of you might look at that and say, see, white people are arrested way more than Blacks. But wait, Just hold on a second. Those are arrested, okay? But then when you go to sentencing, a total of 1,459,533 of those people were actually sentenced. Of those, 440,200 were white, and 487,300 were black. And again, you might look at those numbers and say, see, that's not many more black people sentenced than white. But let's look a little bit deeper at those numbers. 6.1 million and change white people were arrested. 440,000 were sentenced. That's 7%. 7% of the white people who were arrested in 2016 were actually sentenced. You ready for the other number? Of the 2.4 million black people who were arrested in 2016, 20.25% were sentenced. So again, how do we argue that it's black people are just more prone to crime, or that it's their fault? So of all the people who were arrested, over 8 million people were arrested. Are you going to argue that the black people were just more guilty than the white people? 13% more? I think this number, I was looking at the numbers and I was like, whoa, but it gets worse. I was going to say better, but it actually gets worse. Okay, now let's talk imprisonment rate. Imprisonment of sentenced prisoners per 100,000 residents, okay? So per 100,000 residents, imprisonment rate. Whites, 274 per 100,000 residents. These are sentenced. They're sentenced. These people are sentenced, okay? So they've been found guilty of crimes, but these are the people who actually go to prison. 274 white people per 100,000 residents, per 100,000 people. You ready for this? What do you think this number is for black people? Any guesses? 274 of sentenced people who go to prison per 100,000 people in the population. 274 for whites. What do you think it is for blacks? This is going to be a premiere, so what do you think? I'm going to hold on a minute. Guesses for blacks? 1,609 per 100,000. This is, and if you don't believe me, go to the Bureau of Justice statistics on the website, .gov. This is actual statistics from the Bureau of Justice. I'm not making this up. This is not fake news. This is real. Per 100,000 residents, 274 sentenced white people go to prison. 1,609 sentenced black people go to prison. You can look it up yourself. I don't know. I mean, how can you say this is not a systemic racist issue? And this is what Black Lives Matter has formed to fight. This is systemic racism right there. That is systemic racism. How can you deny it's anything else? Okay? How can you deny, number one, of all the people arrested, black people are 13% more likely to get sentenced, and then almost 5 times as likely to go to prison once they're sentenced. So I have the book, The New Jim Crow, which I'm dying to read. I haven't started it yet, but I know that a lot of the argument is that prisons are the modern slavery. So again, we can't look at what's going on in today's culture without examining history. Slavery has morphed, it almost seems, and that in my last video, I talked about the post-slavery era when they were rounding up black Americans for simple things like loitering, because there was a loophole in the 13th Amendment that said that if you're guilty of a crime, if you're a prisoner, you can still be used for free labor. And I made the point in that video that they are still being used for free labor. So I don't know, this number, I mean, literally, like when I was doing this math and really digging into this data, my jaw just dropped. That's pretty stark. So some people are calling the Black Lives Matter movement the largest movement in the history of the United States, the largest civil rights movement in the United States. And it is a movement that is really meant to bring awareness to these issues and to help pass legislation. Like Alicia said in that interview, it's about bringing awareness. It's about trying to change laws. It's about trying to just help everyone see that we have systemic racism, that we still have problems in this country with equality. And if you want to know what the purpose and what the goals of Black Lives Matter is, I suggest going to their website. But this is just a partial list of some of their missions. We see ourselves as part of the global Black family, and we are aware of the different ways we are impacted or privileged as Black people who exist in different parts of the world. We are guided by the fact that all Black lives matter. Every day we commit to healing ourselves and each other, and to co-creating alongside comrades, allies, and family a culture where each person feels seen, heard, and supported. We acknowledge, respect, and celebrate differences and commonalities. And I could go on, but do you see anywhere in here, or have you heard anywhere in here where it says that we want to kill white people, we want to bring down the system, we want to somehow hurt white people, that advocating violence, that we're advocating violence against white people? No, that's just simply not true. I actually saw a letter. I think someone on one of my Facebook groups posted something anti-BLM, that they're Marxists, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, and they're racist, that they hate white people. And I went and looked at her timeline. She literally had a letter on a Black Lives Matter letterhead that allegedly was sent out, saying, basically advocating and promoting violence against white people, saying that our goal is to kill all white people. This person literally had that letter on their, they were sharing this letter as if it were real. And, you know, as I see it, I don't understand how anyone can believe that. And do you even fact check things like that? I mean, who? So here's how I see it. And I see this happening so much in today's society with a lot of things that are going on. I have just talked a lot about how white people have used violence, mob violence, lynching, horrible, horrific things against Black people to keep them down. And now that Black people, well, not now, but through the whole civil rights and Martin Luther King and even peaceful protests, and John Lewis, who believed in peaceful protest and it was beaten and his skull was fractured trying to vote, whites have systemically used violence against Black people. And now that Black people and women, victims of sexual abuse and more secular society and LGBTQ people, now that we are all rising up and demanding to be heard, it seems to me that the powers that be are attributing their methods, their tools, their violent tendencies on us. Does that make sense? So it's almost like the abuser is accusing the victim of being the abuser. I mean, that's kind of what it feels like to me. It's like the whole Me Too movement. Oh, you know, they're crazy. They just want to bring down good men. Well, no, you're the ones who've been silencing us all these years. And it seems to me that I think that a lot of people in our society who don't necessarily have critical thinking skills, who don't necessarily know how to fact check, who might be more susceptible to believing the patriarchy, believing the people in power. But I think that certain groups in our society are trained to not question and to just have faith. And I think that that is detrimental to critical thinking. And that is kind of what I'm seeing. And you know, I'm also seeing people on my Facebook, and yeah, I'm deleting people who are promoting false narratives. I'm deleting people who are promoting fake news. That certain news outlets are saying that Black Lives Matter are killing Black children. Why in the world would Black Lives Matter people kill Black people? Why would they kill? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. And yet these are the narratives that are getting promoted, and certain people believe them. So I do these videos not as a complete, textbook. I'm not claiming to know everything. I'm just hopefully giving people food for thought. And really what I want to do is encourage people to go beyond maybe your normal sources. This whole project of As I See It Tuesday videos has really helped me understand that, some of my news sources aren't as reliable as I thought they were, and is forcing me to go out and seek other sources for my information. And it's also taught me that not everything that I believed is accurate. So that's, I talked a little bit about what BLM is all about and what they're not about. They are not about killing white people. They're not about bringing down the democracy. And in fact, that leads me to one of the things that I wanted to talk about as far as Patrisse Cullors in an interview saying that she was a trained Marxist. And I was going to call this myth number 1, but it's not really a myth, apparently. I looked at PolitiFact, and there might be some truth to the fact that she identifies as a trained Marxist. But what does that really mean? Marxism can mean a lot of things. And this myth that just because she said that she's a trained Marxist and that maybe a couple of the founders believe in Marxism, that means they want to overthrow democracy, they want to overthrow the government. How many of you have actually read Karl Marx? Yeah, there is some of it that says that the proletariat class needs to overthrow the capitalist bosses and the people in charge in order to be totally free of capitalism. That is part of it. But if you really read Marx, the Communist Manifesto, like I have, what I took out of it is not like a violent overthrow of democracy, but more about getting equality for the working class, not letting the big business and I think most of us can agree right now that our economy, our country is owned by big business. Raise your hand. I bet every single one of you, whether you agree with my politics or not, would believe that big business has way too much control over us and our government, right? Well, that's what Karl Marx says. Karl Marx says that given free market society left to its own devices, that is exactly what's going to happen, and the little people like us are going to be shit on. Sure, part of what he says is a revolution to overthrow that class. Who can disagree with that? So I think that the myth that just because they might believe in some parts of Marxism, or even, I don't know, I still don't know if I completely believe this, and it hasn't been completely 100% substantiated. I'll put the PolitiFact article below. But I think that's one of the biggest myths, is that just because they believe in Marxism, they want to overthrow the United States and democracy. I don't think that's true. I think what they are really saying, or what they really believe, and who knows, maybe their belief has evolved, is that they believe in equality for everybody, like many of us do, but especially Black lives historically in this country have been the victims of a capitalist society in the form of free labor, right, in slavery, and still in the form of cheap labor, if not free labor, in the prison system. So that's myth number 1 that I wanted to address. Myth number 2. George Soros is funding BLM and paying to bus protesters to the front lines of the protests and things like that. That is false. So who is George Soros? I had to do a little bit of research. I've heard a lot about his name. He is 89 years old. He's from Hungary, and he made a lot of money on speculating British currency or something like that, but he became a billionaire, and he is a liberal. He's anti-authoritarian. He's contributed to anti-authoritarian causes around the world. And because he's a liberal and he's a philanthropist and he's donated millions of dollars to anti-authoritarian causes and other liberal causes around the world, he has become a target for conservatives and conspiracy theories. And from what I read, much of the conspiracy theories and targeting against him started with Russia for some reason, and now it has come into the mainstream of America through some of the alt-right sources and Fox News and things like that. So here are some of the conspiracy theories that have been floating. That he pays protesters. And Snopes says there's no evidence at all to suggest that demonstrators are paid by Soros or his organizations. that he pays to, another myth is that he pays to transport protesters. And there was a photo circulating claiming to show two buses emblazoned with the words Soros Riot Dance Squad. And the photo was cited as proof that Soros was involved in the protests, but the photo was doctored. It was a fake photo, according to Snopes. And experts, according to Snopes, experts say that all of the new conspiracy theories about Soros is a way to discredit the BLM movement and the current protests. And myth number 3 is that all the money that individuals and companies donate to Black Lives Matter goes to a super PAC to support Democrats and liberal causes and Democratic candidates, and that's just false. And I mean, I could spend a whole video talking about all the myths about Black Lives Matter, but basically I'll put my sources below. Just go to PolitiFact or go to Snopes and you'll find out that that's not true. And if you want to read about the intricacies of super PAC money and all the money that goes to Black Lives Matter, I'll put a link below, but I don't think it's really worth going into. I also don't think it's worth going into every single myth about Black Lives Matter because there are a lot. But the last one that I do want to talk about is the violence at the protests supposedly by Black Lives Matter. That the Black Lives Matter is with Antifa, and Antifa is nothing but a terrorist organization, when in fact Antifa isn't even a single group. It's not like there's no structure, there's no organized group there. It's nothing. It's more of an ideology than it is an actual organized group. So it's basically just a bunch of people around the country who share an ideology and maybe might show up at a protest all dressed in black or wearing a sticker or some kind of emblem, but there is no organization from what I understand and everything that I'm reading. What unites them is common ground opposing fascism and racism. So people who identify with Antifa might show up, for example, at white supremacist rallies and just stand there and, and show their opposition to racism and fascism. That's what Antifa is. And so this idea that Black Lives Matter and Antifa are spreading violence in their protests, from what I'm reading, is completely false. One thing that I think a lot of people who hate the idea of Black Lives or Black Lives Matter or still want to uphold the patriarchy and white supremacy and the status quo want to blame the black people. This is how I see it. We as a country, as a nation, we go to war, and everything that I've talked about in this video about all the instances of white violence against blacks and wars and, white nationalists and shooting up schools and all the other things, all the other crimes, all the other murders and all the other violence that is committed by whites. And we tend to get outraged whenever that violence is at the hands of non-white Americans. It seems that the only time we have a problem with violence is when it's not delivered by white people. All of this outrage over Black Lives Matter and all of the conspiracy theories and all of the lies just feels to me like more attempts to keep the status quo and to keep white supreme in this country. Why else are there so many lies? Why else are there doctored videos and doctored images? And even Fox News just recently had to take down some images that were doctored about the protests in Seattle and the false narrative that they were promoting. So I'm going to leave you finally with one last myth busted here. That is about Antifa and Black Lives Matter and the violence at the protests that many, including the President of the United States, want to blame on non-white citizens of this country. So these are a couple tweets by the president. The memory of George Floyd is being dishonored by rioters, looters, and anarchists. The violence and vandalism is being led by Antifa and other radical left-wing groups who are terrorizing the innocent, destroying jobs, hurting businesses, and burning down buildings. Another tweet by the president. I don't see any indication that there were any white supremacist groups mixing in. This is an Antifa organization which is an oxymoron. I just said Antifa is not an organization. It's just individuals showing up. And finally, one more tweet by the president. Our nation has been gripped by professional anarchists. Violent mobs, arsonists, looters, criminals, rioters, Antifa, and others. And that others is Black Lives Matter. So one thing that a lot of people jump to conclusions about and tend to ignore is that while Antifa, number one, is not an organized organization, but Black Lives Matter is, the protests going on in the name of Black Lives Matter after George Floyd, for the most part, statistically speaking, have been very peaceful protests. And every single study has shown that during peaceful protest, the hooligans and the hoodlums and all the people who just are looking for an excuse to loot and steal and commit crimes use the cover of the protest to do so. Think about it. You know, there's safety in numbers. So it brings out the bad guys. That does not make the protesters themselves the bad guys. And in fact, one more thing. From the Washington Post says the fact checker video team spoke to witnesses and reviewed arrest records, federal charges, intelligence reports, online conversations, and dozens of videos and photos of violent incidents from the early days of protests in Minneapolis to determine whether a coordinated Antifa campaign was responsible for the violence. Okay, they reviewed protests in more than 140 cities with U.S. officials within the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Most of the violence, they said, was committed by, quote, local hooligans, sometimes gangs, sometimes just individuals who are trying to take advantage of an opportunity. This is from a fact checker task force. But there were reports of some Antifa at different protests, they concluded, but they stood back, did not engage, and certainly not in any violent way. There was a concerted effort by alt-right activists not just to conflate the protest with Antifa, but to get Antifa declared a terrorist organization by the United States. We see there was a coordinated, essentially series of petitions and online lobbying effort. And Trump fell in line and tweeted the false conspiracy theories about a 75-year-old protester in Buffalo who was shoved by police. Trump promoted a conspiracy theory that he was Antifa, which was completely wrong. No evidence whatsoever that he was affiliated with any groups. And finally, they say there has not yet been a single confirmed case in which someone who self-identifies as Antifa led violent acts at any protests across the country. So I will put the source. This is a Washington Post article that's well sourced and fact-checked, and I'll put the link to that in the video description so you can check it out for yourself. So the violence during the BLM protests. Here is the list of recorded violence I have found at the BLM protests across the country. In Illinois, hate crime charges against a white motorcycle rider who ran into a crowd of protesters, hurting 2 people. In Virginia, a KKK leader tried to drive his car into a crowd of protesters. In Wisconsin, a white man was trying to run over a black woman in a parking lot. In Wisconsin, a lawyer spit on a black teenager, allegedly. These are all alleged, by the way. In Wisconsin, allegedly, a lawyer spit on a black teen and he was charged with a hate crime. Another white man allegedly burned Thea Bernstein and is charged with a hate crime. Kentucky, a black church was allegedly shot firearm down by 5 white people. Virginia, 5 white people face hate crime charges for an alleged attack on a black protester. And the list goes on. There is a long list of violence during protests similar to this. So this is how I see it, that the powers that be Just like in the history of the United States, trying to preserve the Confederate soldiers who wanted to preserve slavery, the white Confederates, daughters of the Confederacy, who wanted to preserve the Southern white supremacy and idolize the soldiers who were willing to die to keep slavery and to keep other human beings enslaved. The legacy of racism through the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights era, where whites systemically used violence to keep black people down, to keep them from exercising their constitutional right to vote, to pursue economic well-being and personal well-being. I mean, all throughout history, we have a history of white people trying to figuratively keep their knee on the neck of African Americans in our culture. It's still happening today. And it's happening today in the form of trying to discredit a movement that is meant to help black people by spreading, and now we have social media, so it's amplified, spreading conspiracy theories, spreading lies, saying that they aren't really who they say they are, that it's all some socialist conspiracy theory to bring down the country. None of that is true. And again, I have a long list of sources that I'm going to put in the description of this video so that you can read up on these things yourself if you don't believe me. But I think the data, the statistics that I gave on the imprisonment of black Americans pretty much speaks for itself. We still have a severe problem with systemic racism and state-sanctioned violence and imprisonment of black Americans in this country, and that is all Black Lives Matter is trying to solve. That's all they want. They're not trying to erase white people. They're not saying that there needs to be violence against white people. Okay, and I can't close out this video with talking about the whole Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, Black Lives Matter, police lives matter. This drives me nuts. This is how I see it. Yes, all lives do matter. And in fact, Alicia says that in her interview.
Let me ask you about this. We've also seen the hashtags All Lives Matter and Police Lives Matter. What's your take on those messages?
Of course, all lives matter, but we live in a society where black lives are systematically devalued and, in fact, targeted for destruction and demise. And so if we really want to build a world where all lives matter, then it means that we will fight like hell today for black lives.
By saying Black Lives Matter, no one is saying that that means only Black Lives Matter. That's not what Black Lives Matter movement is about. And for those of you who want to scream, and I've been seeing it in my comments, all lives matter, all lives matter. You know what? If all lives really mattered, we wouldn't need a Black Lives movement. If all lives really mattered, we wouldn't see 5 times the number of black men imprisoned for crimes that they have been sentenced for than white men, white people. Women too, and what I know, black women are historically even ignored more than black men and oppressed more than black men. The reason we need a Black Lives Movement matter is because all lives have not included black lives. They are killed, they are murdered, they are imprisoned, they are arrested, they are harassed, they are oppressed. And what are people outraged about? Vandalism on monuments. When people are as outraged over the way we treat black and brown lives in this country as they are about things, and I think I will do my next video about violent protest because I have a lot to say on that. And I'm not condoning violence. I'm just saying that this outrage over things, again, kneeling and songs and flags and monuments, more outrage over things than people. Yeah, Black Lives, we need a Black Lives Matter movement because no, all lives do not include black lives. And when they do, then we will not need a Black Lives movement. That's how I look at it. So to say, when somebody says Black Lives Matter, and you say all lives matter, you are continuing the narrative that no, black lives really don't matter. Because what all lives matter really means is white lives matter, right? Let's face it. Let's be honest. That's really what it means. It's like, again, kneel, knee on the throat, heel on the head, or whatever. It's another way to say stay in your place. you don't really matter. It really means white lives matter. You can deny it, and you probably will, but that's how I see it. White people, they're not saying that there needs to be violence against white people. I mean, just if you see anything that just sounds, just please do your research, please fact check. And I know a lot of people aren't even going to agree with the sources that I have used to create this video today. I will say that I use media bias check to check my media sources. Every source that I have used in this video for my information rated either highly accurate or mostly highly accurate or something like that, but you can check for yourself. So there was a lot of information in this video, and I hope that you enjoyed it. Once again, I hope it was some food for thought. Remember that there are still powers that want to keep black people in their place, that there is still white supremacy alive and kicking in this country, and it may not be taking the form of fire hoses and dogs and batons on backs, although it is. I'm seeing video of that. We have more technology now to discredit and to spread lies about a movement that is really meant to promote equality for everybody. Thank you all so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed this Tuesday As I See It video. I'll see you next time. In the meantime, be happy, be free, and be kind. I'll see you soon.